Now, listen, just to get us kicked off, I think that this book Bates has written, it's a really interesting book at this particular moment of our sort of relationship with China, because he sort of takes the lid off of Xi Jinping's head insofar as one can. And there are very few people besides Brother Kevin Rudd and Bates who've actually read all of Xi Jinping's work, which is it's an arduous task, the 4 volumes of Governance in China. And he's tried, to the degree that one can these days, plumb what it is that motivates Xi and what we can expect from Xi. And that's quite a task. But it's strange that we find ourselves back in a world where we are reading texts once again, looking at photographs, and trying to figure out what's going on within the black box of China, which is exactly, I should say, where I came into this whole proposition decades ago, when Mao Zedong was still alive, and we couldn't go there. We are, I'm afraid, slowly being decoupled, not just with industries and trade, but I think our abilities to maintain friendship, collegiate relationships as scholars, as journalists, as business people, scientists even, everything now is in a state of some peril. So, Bates, let's start off. I want to begin with, just to get you to limn for us your sort of the core of the book, which are the 6 core ambitions of Xi Jinping. So let's just get that list implanted in everybody's head.
Okay. Thank you very much, Orville. And I also want to just extend my gratitude to you, your generosity. I think this is the 3rd or 4th time we've been able to sit next to each other in just the past week and enjoy one another's company. And I so look forward to working with you and really together our 2 centers synergizing and creating just what I hope will be one of the leading concentrations of China expertise in the United States, if not even in the world. Very exciting prospect.
Indeed.
And I'm really looking forward to working with you on that. I want to also extend my gratitude to Rory Daniels and everybody at the Asia Society Policy Institute for helping host this and joining forces with the U.S. China Relations Center to launch this this book series. Which with the title we sort of came up with was China-wise, and that was drawn from a Chinese saying where you have there, it's a dui shu zeng yi zhi. So read a book, become knowledgeable, or become wise. It's an old saying, and we're hopeful that our book collaboration here will be an opportunity to gain that.
Here's the first pathway to wisdom right here, and it's on sale outside.
So to get to your question, so the book was an attempt to try and unpack and make somewhat less complex what is obviously a very, very complex and difficult subject, and that is China's foreign policy under Xi Jinping. I thought it was a timely moment. We're soon going to be hitting the 10-year mark that he has been paramount leader. We have every expectation that he's going to continue in that role. And I hadn't seen a good book that was written in a way that was accessible, not densely theoretical, nor narrowly focusing only on a certain country's interests like the United States, but rather a book that could be read and understood, hopefully enjoyed, by students, by business people, by government folks, and especially by people who aren't China experts, but who want to learn and try to understand. And then I thought, well, how am I going to do that? A lot of authors, academics, will approach this subject of Chinese foreign policy by, you've got a chapter on the United States, you've got a chapter on Taiwan relations, you've got a chapter on relations with Japan, you've got a chapter on so-called functional issues, trade, non-proliferation, whatever. And I said, I don't want to do that. That's what everybody does, in a way. And I thought, okay, how do I come up with a sort of graphic representation of what I think are the ambitions or goals of Chinese foreign policy? And that's where I came up with these 6 goals. And I put them in the form of a Venn diagram with legitimacy as number 1 at the center of the Venn diagram, and then 5 overlapping circles which overlap most at the center, where legitimacy, and those other five being, let's see, we had legitimacy, sovereignty, wealth, power, leadership, and ideas. So those six. And that sort of forms the core 6 chapters of the book. And what I go on to do then is show how does the pursuit of legitimacy, for example, by the Chinese Communist Party then affect how China operates internationally. Similarly, how does the pursuit of sovereignty and how does the pursuit of wealth, how does the pursuit of power, by which I define as hard power, inducements and coercion, military and economic leverage, the pursuit of leadership and the pursuit of ideas, how does that then spill over into and massively affect how China's foreign policy is operated?
Okay, so you, with those sort of imperatives in mind, Bates has written, to be respected in the world and receive its due is the answer that you got from one person in regard to what it is that she would like to see happen. Now, let me ask you this. Is it possible to be respected and receive your due if you do not act respectably? And do you think, and we have a good example in Putin, I think we would all agree, is not acting in a manner which is deserving of respectability. How would you rate China on that Richter scale?
Well, I think the implied answer, I think that you're right to bring up in that question is reflected across all 6 of these pursuits, and it's basically the very pursuit of them. Mm-hmm. Actually, in my mind, undermines China's ability to ultimately achieve them. But that the imperative of pursuing them by the party, risks and all, is deemed to be less risky to them than not pursuing them. I hope that all makes a logical
do you think,
sense.
Well,
so the answer to your question would be no. Because ultimately, if what we're being asked to do is to proffer respect and approbation, even appreciation, to a one-party Leninist state, that's going to be very, very difficult for many. And what I think we end up seeing, rather than sort of being respected or loved, maybe we see more a regime that is respected but feared at best.
So this raises the important question that can one be coerced into respect? And if not, what is the result of the kind of, and you have chapter and verse of this on every page of your book, whether it's the THAAD missile example, Australia beef over, the Wuhan virus, et cetera. Do you think it's possible for a country to build a position that's sustainable in the world if it is not, let's just say, loved, but tolerated because of pressure?
It strikes me that the Chinese leadership believes that that is possible, because that's precisely what they're attempting to do. I mean, I can't believe that leaders in Zhongnanhai don't know that there's growing pushback, growing headwinds on many of the pursuits of these ambitions that I lay out in the book. They must understand that, and perhaps they've reached the calculation that respect perhaps simply means a sort of forced alignment, if not appreciation or approbation, at least a self-interested willingness on the part of others to align more closely with Chinese interests. And maybe that's ultimately good enough for respect as far as the Chinese leadership is concerned. But I think there's actually a deeper sort of, what's the word I want? A deeper kind of urge or wish for respect and appreciation and acceptance. We see that very clearly in the language that comes out of Xi Jinping and many, many others, that there is a need, Wang Yi said it the other day here at the Asia Society, the need to accept diversity with unity, relying on an old Confucian concept. What it means in the contemporary context is that we accept China's form of governance and accept that diversity, and in so doing, be more capable of reaching common ground and unity. But I think it's going to be it continues to be a very hard sell.
Well, I think if I read your book correctly, and it really, and you just sort of said it, it seems to me the goal, if you wrap up all of these 6 ambitions of China, is for Xi Jinping to have the world say, oh, China's been incredibly successful. You've created an economic miracle, and we want to applaud you, respect you, and accept you. Would you say that's what his dream is?
Or maybe all of that, applauding, appreciating, and accepting also includes leaving us alone, letting us run things within China.
Do you mean the world or just China?
I think leaving us alone, leaving China alone. Yeah. Don't try to undermine us. Don't try to delegitimate us. It's like that first line in the book. We want to be respected, receive our due, and you'll have to get used to it. That was the line. You'll just have to get used to it. But I don't think the world's getting used to it, to be honest. And that's the conundrum.
And it seems to me that the imputations of what you write are not only is the world not getting used to it, but that in fact Xi Jinping's strategies often are alienating the world actively rather than just sort of neutrally.
Right, and so I sort of sum up towards the end of the book about how across these 6 various goals we see increasing headwinds, increasing pushback, and yet I suspect, and we'll see, what comes out of the 20th Party Congress this month, but I suspect we'll see a further doubling down on the part of Xi in the pursuit of these ambitions, even though I think they must recognize that the risks in doing so are increasing.
So I think that, the question that many of us are wondering about is, China has accomplished an extraordinary feat. From going from what was the sick man of Asia within the lifetime of some of us to this economic powerhouse, global trade powerhouse. Do you think Xi Jinping is going to put all this at risk, or do you think, like Henry Kissinger said the other day, and I just had this really interesting conversation with Frank Brown where I asked him this very question, do you think he's going to come to his senses and reassess in a way which doesn't push China or the world to the brink, which would have the potential to really undermine this immense success story?
It's possible, I suppose. All things could be listed as possible. I just don't think it's likely. I think maybe this draws a bit from the title of the book. Xi and others at that leadership level clearly recognize that there are these big challenges ahead. But the answer is not, okay, well, then let's find a compromise. Let's accommodate. Let's dare to struggle. Let's fight to win. That is the message to the Chinese people and to the party especially about what to do in the face of these headwinds. So I don't see anything so far in his leadership style or more broadly in what is apparently what seems to be rather solid support for his approach within the party. I don't see anything which would indicate a more accommodating, position. Now, what could change that? Well, I think Dr. Kissinger is right to have us look carefully at what's unfolding with Russia, and were that to go even more in a bad direction for Putin, obviously that would have to force some recalibration on Xi's part. But you could also envision a scenario where he, rather than accommodating that disaster for his foreign policy approach, might actually lead to a further doubling down on his part, possibly. Another scenario, I suppose, would be if he were to really run up against some serious internal, within the party, I mean.
Or it could be economic.
Dissent, yeah, a sort of upsurge of domestic difficulty where he'd have to accommodate somewhat. But I wouldn't suspect that his first move would be, for example, to reach an accommodation with the United States. I don't think that would be his first move. It might be, to try and tinker with the domestic political or domestic economic dashboard in order to try and accommodate those internal concerns. But all in all, I think a lot of what I just laid out presumes certain scenarios and outcomes that we just can't know right now. Particularly the issue of whether is Putin going down or not. I don't think we really know that yet.
The title of your book, of course, is Daring to Struggle. And I should say personally, when I first went to China, which was during the Cultural Revolution, when Mao was still alive, that was the leitmotif of the country's struggle, class struggle. There were antagonistic contradictions, as Mao said, between different classes and different systems in the world. And then, of course, we went into this amazing period when Deng Xiaoping suddenly heaved to on the horizon. And struggle, nationalism, and these things were put aside. And we thought that he had sort of waved his magic wand and sort of banished that earlier world of Maoist tension, struggle, adversity, animosity, and that it was gone. But now we find it back again. Do you think that this re-emphasis on struggle, where very often, I think for Xi, as you point out, one of his greatest fears is weakness, means that it's difficult for him to be a good diplomat, because diplomacy always implies give a little to get a little?
I think, yes, I find that, curiously, China, in many respects, is painting itself into a smaller and smaller corner on a lot of these issues, leaving very little wiggle room, especially with his own domestic audiences, which I believe are the most important audiences, in particular a small subset of the domestic audience of about 100 million people called the Chinese Communist Party, and has painted himself in a way that would, I think, make it very difficult for him to show accommodation, to show flexibility, to back down off of some of the grand ambitions which he's laid out for himself and for his legacy and for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So, yeah, I don't see that provides him a lot of wiggle room. I think, too, just as an individual, I suspect he is uncomfortable in sort of what can sometimes be seen as a bit of a clubby atmosphere, at the Davos level of engagement, or at the G20 level of engagement. His English is not good. I've been told, I've never met him, but I've been told that he, is not that sort of friendly, backslapping political type of figure, but rather is more reserved, less competent, and appearing somewhat less competent, at least in that direct give and take that leaders have to have. So you add it all together, and I think it makes his work as a diplomat far more difficult to be accommodating or to find common ground.
That's sort of an interesting point, because I think if you go through all of the earlier Chinese leaders, Mao Zedong will set him aside for a minute, but Hu Yaobang, Zhao Ziyang, particularly Jiang Zemin, who at the time, I think many of us thought was a bit clownish, right? a little bit, over the top. He was doing the Gettysburg Address in English. He was singing songs in Italian. But I have to say, having watched him with someone like Bill Clinton, he wanted to be sort of in the world of the leaders. He wanted to be part of that. Do you feel that Xi Jinping feels that he can't contend in that world, doesn't want to be in that world, doesn't feel safe in it, doesn't speak foreign languages, not been abroad, that as you say, it's a kind of a club that he feels he can be powerful, but he can't be absorbable?
Right. I think that's probably right. I mean, and this is all armchair psychology here, so it's really hard to know exactly. But I do think that, that sort of background of his differs from some of his predecessors in terms of their international engagement. I suspect, too, at least trying to rely upon what he says and the sort of policies he tries to drive, there does seem to be a sort of underlying mistrust and a discomfort with the West. And maybe, look no further than the sorts of persons that he has apparently chosen to be closest to and meet the most with on the international scene. Now, you could argue that's not really a function of his personality. It's just a function of the way the geopolitics of the world have gone. It's just unlikely that he and Joe Biden are going to be pals. That's just the way it is right now.
But we did actually at one point think they might be.
For a while, we thought so. And maybe it's a good thing that the two have spent as much time together as they did when they were both vice presidents. And of course, the Obama administration, I think, worked pretty hard to try and create that sort of, going to sunny lands, yeah. The Sunny Lands Summit, and you had the famous picture of the two of them walking together, Winnie the Pooh and Tigger. It was great. So there was, I think, an effort, but it obviously didn't work, or it didn't seem to work very well. So there's something there within his personality, his persona, his level of comfort that I think makes it more difficult. It's already difficult, but it makes it even more difficult to try and reach that kind of leader-to-leader understanding.
Yeah. Do you think that Xi Jinping has assessed China's national security accurately or inaccurately? In other words, that what ultimately is best for China going forward in the world, since it is a member of the world community. Do you think he's really off base in his assessment about what's best for China, or do you think this could work out for him?
Well, I think he's off base, and I think a lot of folks on the outside of China scratch their heads and wonder, what's with wolf warrior diplomacy, for example? It just seems so consciously intended to undermine Chinese authority and influence in the world. But I think if that's the way we want to frame it, I think we're getting it wrong. And again, this is armchair psychology, and I try to draw this out a little bit more in the book to explain my logic here. But I think it's because you used the term national security, which I think is interesting. I think a better term to help us understand Xi's approach would be regime security. And I go at length in there, drawing from some of Steve Tsang's work, where he talks about how, a party-state nationalism, a party-state foreign policy is a better way of understanding what Xi represents in the world, rather than talking about national interests or national security. And so under that logic, if what your number one priority is legitimacy and survival and long-term sustainability of the Chinese Communist Party as a model to govern China, you can quite quickly see where that sometimes actually runs contrary to the interests of the state, of national security. It can, unless you wish to believe that, which is what I think Xi Jinping wants everyone to understand, that party security, regime security, is national security, right?
Do you think he believes that?
I do, and if that's correct, then that I think helps us at least understand what otherwise we would see as being contrary to China's national interests. Then the deeper question is, you're probably going to get to it, is, well, why is that? What's he afraid of?
Yeah.
Right?
Good.
Why is he afraid of regime security? Right? I mean, he seems to be at the top of his game, doesn't he? And, there I think, obviously, we get into the questions of, on the international scene, his continued concerns that people are out to get the party, undermine its legitimacy.
Is he right?
I think so. I mean, of course, American presidents, at least the last several, I don't know if I remember Donald Trump ever saying this, but most American presidents have always said that, our intention is not to undermine the regime. And Joe Biden's been very clear on that. He's stated it several times. But does that mean if you asked Joe Biden, would you prefer to have a different government in power in China? He would say, no.
You better not ask. He might answer it.
So I think she's probably right to have those concerns. And of course, he faces a lot of, not he, I should say the party and the leadership model and China's own, economic and social and political situation at home also faces a lot of challenges. And I think that helps explain, why she and his, closest advisors have pushed so heavily to define what security means, primarily in terms of domestic challenges and that they need to overcome. So I think they do see challenges out there, and they feel that they need to struggle against them. And that just spills over into the foreign policy and I think makes it the troubled and more contested sets of relationships that China now has with much of the world.
Before we throw it open to you all for questions, let me ask one final question. When Xi Jinping meets Biden in Bali, which is presumably going to happen, if Biden says to Xi, listen, you and I are the two big dogs on the block here, and we're heading for a very dangerous horizon. Let's us work this thing out. I want to work with you. I don't want the world to end up as we see Russia and Europe. What do you think Xi's response would be? Do you think there's anything that he would feel comfortable accepting and saying, I got it, good, let's you and I do something here? I mean, that's basically what Kissinger was hoping for.
Yes. I mean, well, I think, in principle, I think Xi would nod his head and say, that's a good idea. And now here are the things you'll need to do for us to...
Here's the list of 14 things to do.
Here's the things you'll need to do in order for us to have that type of relationship. And, of course, some of those would be unacceptable. Or at least it would be difficult for an American president to swallow, let alone then issue some sort of joint statement that demonstrates acceptance of them. For example, readily accepting that Taiwan's status will be determined solely by Beijing.
Yeah.
I mean, Xi may be right that if we went that pathway, we could avoid a lot of difficulty.
Yeah, just give it to them.
But, that's not going to happen. I thought one thing Dr. Kissinger said that might be, we could hope could emerge from their conversation, the Xi-Biden conversation, would be that the two sides say to one another, we will not do anything that we know would be a likely cause for war.
Is that likely?
That's a grand statement, but that would mean that Xi Jinping would pretty much have to agree then not to use force to reconcile its preferred outcomes with Taiwan.
So unlikely.
Yeah. So even something as grand as that, and is actually noble, that two great leaders ought to be able to say to one another, the state of the relationship and the distrust and the political differences are such that even something like that is going to be difficult.
All right. On that cheery note, let's throw it open. Frank.
Thanks for a very interesting conversation. Look forward to reading the book. I come at this as a business person and an investor, so rank amateur. But I think there are some interesting parallels in terms of, and why I conclude that Xi and his team are more rational than not, and certainly a hell of a lot more rational than Putin. And if you look at, Jack Ma was thrown under the bus. He's reemerged. Alibaba continues to thrive. Ant Financial continues to thrive despite them being slapped down. Initially, all Chinese companies were going to have to delist in the U.S. There's been an accommodation reached by both sides on that. So I kind of draw the parallel and say, I think their approach is to bend things but not break them. And that leads me to wonder, will that same logic apply to other things like Taiwan, like the South China Sea, et cetera, et cetera? So just a thought. Interested in your perspective.
That's a good point, and I guess a ready response might be that we've seen traditionally in China's sort of grand strokes of policy, especially since the Deng Xiaoping era, that there's likely to be more flexibility and accommodation and willingness to bend but not break on economic questions, because it is so clearly in China's self-interest to do what it can to continue the economic engine, although we know it's going to get more and more difficult for them to do so, and not entirely because of the difficulties in the geopolitical sphere, but because of their own some self-inflicted choices. But I would say less so the bending but not breaking. It strikes me is becoming less a part of that grand strategic view around more sensitive political and territorial sovereignty issues in particular. So I think you're right to point to examples of flexibility, and we can hope that can continue, and the degree to which it can flow into the conversation between the United States and China, for example, on the delisting question, great. But I don't see that unfolding on the issues that you noted on the, I would just say, more geopolitical or diplomatic front. It's just, I think there's been such a hardening of positions, really, on both sides, in many respects, that's going to be difficult to walk back.
Yes. Introduce yourself so that we know who you are.
I can hear you.
Never used. Can you hear? Perfect. My name's Amalia. I'm a master's student at NYU, and I'm studying the future of international relations right now. And so I was interested really in your kind of closing comment when you were outlining or alluding to kind of red lines and what would likely cause war. Just given the kind of increasingly convoluted sense of what war looks like today, what, in your opinion, and especially, remaining wary of, seduction by analogy and not trying to draw similarities to the Cold War or proxy wars or anything like that, what do you think a war with China would look like?
Wow, that's a great question.
Really cutting to the chase.
Let's get a dissertation or two written on that. Well, I think I'm drawing from your excellent question the implication, which I think is correct, that that war, I hate to even think about it, that I hope will never happen, would be unlikely to unfold in a way similar to, say, the Fulda Gap of the Cold War conceptions of warfare. And that's because, as we can see in Ukraine, as just maybe one early example, that the nature of warfare is so dramatically changing. And we know from what we can glean in terms of the People's Liberation Army reform, reorganization, and modernization process, especially under Xi Jinping, that they too understand that the nature of warfare is changing and are investing very, very heavily in let's just say, less kinetic forms of warfare that can, which in some ways I think are consistent with the famous, Sunzian maxim of, being able to win a war without firing a shot. So what are we talking about? Cyber warfare, gray zone, so-called gray zone tactics, less attributable forms of threat and coercion. And China is developing these. So I suspect, I mean, if someday in the next 10 years, the decision is made in Zhongnanhai to begin to use forms of coercion and force to assert China's claims over Taiwan, I think it would start in these less noticeable ways. I don't think it's going to be a massing of 300,000 PLA soldiers opposite Taiwan, but rather in these less obvious, either through cyber warfare, maybe through space-based uses of coercion and attack, crippling Taiwanese communications, sowing discord and confusion within Taiwan society. All that can be done without firing a single missile or launching a single airplane. And the purpose of that would be to try to achieve then victory, or at least a fait accompli, with the Taiwanese people way before the United States, almost way before they can make a decision about what to do about it. Because obviously, a full-blown military attack in that more traditional sense, that would prompt a U.S. response. It would prompt a response from Japan. It would prompt a response from Australia. It would prompt a response from Europe. And maybe in that sense, this is where Putin really screwed up, that he wasn't more clever and less kinetic in how he could have asserted himself or assert Russia's claims against Ukraine. And maybe the Chinese, I think the Chinese already understood that, but they're certainly drawing more lessons now from what they're seeing in Ukraine.
The commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet described it as a silkworm nibbling at a leaf, bit by bit by bit. And I think you're probably right that she's a smart man, and I think he will try to avoid any kind of big bang that would be the casus belli that would give the U.S. and allies any sort of irrefutable grounds like Putin's invasion.
And not to mention, I mean, what would it mean for your future relationship with the people of Taiwan if you've just killed 100,000 people? I mean, so I find the invasion scenario hard to believe.
And yet it didn't stop Putin.
Right. It was a huge mistake.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Hi, Avi Samadrola. I'm a public markets investor. I'm curious, given what's going on with China regarding the housing issues and the unrest with the population that's maybe not so fortunate economically, what kind of risk does that play to the party and the leadership of the party? And is that potential for a change in leadership?
I think the short answer would be no, it probably doesn't. But you're right to flag it and to take note of it, because it strikes me that the degree of this, sort of unrest, alienation, unhappiness within society seems to be percolating to a higher and more noticeable level than we've seen now at any time during Xi Jinping's leadership, and is reminiscent somewhat of what we saw, a little bit more of, say, in the late 90s and early 2000s, where there was a significant degree of social unrest and dissent, which I think many of us had thought that she had done so much to curtail or quash. Now we see it bubbling up a little bit. But I don't think it has risen at all to the level of threatening the stability of the regime. And in fact, I'm intrigued by some analysis that one of our center's fellows is doing in relation to the alienation and the angst factor and the increasing pressures on middle and lower class persons in China, where he argues that that's absolutely growing. It is becoming more and more difficult for persons of those levels in Chinese society to make ends meet. The expansion in terms of inequality in education that's occurring, and which then helps explain why Xi has made so much of the common prosperity agenda. It might explain why Xi has taken some steps against the extreme, the fabulously wealthy folks like Jack Ma and others to try and rein in some of their actions, and it may explain why he's been as tough as he has in regards to corruption within the party and so on. But there's another explanation which this fellow has pointed to that may help us understand why the regime is probably a little bit more safe in response to this disgruntlement, and that is pumping up the propaganda machine within China to blame the outside world for the troubles that these folks are facing. So it's America's fault that there's COVID in the United States, or in China, right? It came from Fort Detrick, and it was purposely spread in China. It's what America is doing to set the West against us that explains our problems in our economic situation. So they've got a lot of tools, not just the surveillance and police forces, but there's this very powerful propaganda machine that can divert attention or help alleviate some of the burden off of the government or off of the party to be blamed for the problems that these folks are facing. So it strikes me that they're using all those tools in ways that are going to help, that probably are going to keep them relatively safe in the face of the sort of disgruntlement that you've identified.
Yeah, hooked up with some good new technology, which really does create I think, a more effective techno-autocracy. Yes, and then.
I'm Peggy Blumenthal from the Institute of International Education, and I totally agree that she is more worried about domestic pressures than international pressures, but I want to ask how you feel about the domestic elites, the young domestic elites, the millions who have come back from study abroad, the millions who now can get their view of the world from the internet and not just rely on Chinese propaganda. Xi's daughter coming back from Harvard, all these other elite governing people whose younger generation feels, probably aren't buying the propaganda.
I think we may have some of them in this room.
Yeah, I was
we should probably ask them. Unfortunately, because of the politics and the pandemic, and it's true for many of us, from a time of going to China 5 or 6 times a year to today, it's much more difficult for me to gauge that sort of question. I'm sad to say that in November will be 3 years since I've been able to go to China, which is just awful, terrible, and I hope it will soon change.
Yeah, anybody who has, I know there are a few folks here who've been back there recently. Would you want to share your thoughts with us? Yeah, Yo-ho.
I probably fit your image of a Chinese young elite educated abroad. My name is He Liu, and I'm based in Beijing. I'm working on effective philanthropies, so trying to get rich folks in China to do the most good for the world. I have my questions of my own, but to address, is the young, rising, foreign educated elite the future of China? I really don't think so. One, studying abroad doesn't mean being away from party propaganda, because most of the Mandarin written material online out there is already censored, and if that's the main source of information, then coming abroad is not a big help. You still use WeChat, you still access Chinese news, you still read whatever information that 环球时报 wants you to read. So I think, and I think a lot of folks coming out of China come from not a background of self-pity, but confidence, probably propped up by the nationalistic education that has happened since 1989. So when they really go abroad, the sense of pride, the sense is confidence, the sense that we are on par with America, and whatever treatment that Asian Americans face in terms of racism, in terms of the lack of voice in America, well, it only strengthens their sense of national pride. So I think many of them coming back from abroad actually treasure the country's narrative and the propaganda a lot more than before coming out to America. So I'm not sure if Western educated elites are your best bets. I mean, the young revolutionaries of communism were Western educated, and look at where the party is going right now. And I have my questions separately, which is, might we all just be overestimating China? I mean, all empires collapse when they overextend themselves, when they stretch too thinly, when ambitions are unbound but capabilities are limited. I see China facing great problems at home with the fiscal situation. I mean, the real estate market has collapsed. Zero COVID policy is impractical. Reining in lots of private markets, then how are you going to get funded for all your ambitions and expeditions? Maybe for the West, the best way is just to leave China alone, to let them run the course and expect a Napoleonic downfall.
Does that mean decoupling, in your view?
Well, maybe not even decoupling, just whatever the CCP wants to do, well, let them do it. And I mean, I look at, for example, the fiscal situation. This year, only the Shanghai government has a surplus. All the other governments have massive deficits, and the Shanghai government only has a tiny surplus. And if we fight war in Taiwan, conscription, that's not going to go well with the population. I mean, they're just holes everywhere.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, and I think the conclusions of the book, while not as eloquently put as you have just made it, reaches a very similar understanding, except perhaps in one case, because I outline that this is just becoming a more difficult swim upstream for China. And that there are a lot of problems and challenges. One of the things I wrote in terms of sort of, I don't go heavy into policy recommendations, but one of the 5 major sort of broad stroke thoughts on that is understand China for both its strengths and its weaknesses. That to overlook the weaknesses and vulnerabilities and challenges, we're going to get it wrong. So I think it's broadly in agreement with your understanding and analysis of how we should understand China today. I see it running into bigger difficulties, more challenges, but here's where I would differ. Letting that run its course, which is probably what's going to happen, may take us into a much more dangerous era, because I don't see that the solution to these challenges in Xi Jinping's view would be, well, maybe I need to change course. Maybe I need to change what I'm doing. Instead, it will be...
So you don't agree with Kissinger.
Right, exactly. Instead, I think, as you put it, it will be a sort of Napoleonic ending. But, that's not a very pleasant prospect to think about either.
How do you stop Napoleon?
Right. Well, if you say let China run its course, then we're not going to be stopping Napoleon.
He'll be stopped at Moscow.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is not a very pleasant future to contemplate.
I think we have time for one more question. That'll be yours.
My name is Erica Peterson. I am a teacher who's taught at Professional Children's School for 2 decades. We had a large international community coming from China, from Korea, from Japan. I taught so many young Chinese people, and I would absolutely agree that they come full of pride. They don't give up their values. I never heard one of them complain at all about the one-child policy. They're really quite in tune with their nation and their national sense. But what I wanted to go back to your idea about Davos and being clubby in Davos and Xi Jinping not, being one of the club. And given what Davos represents to me, I think I'm asking you, what would he be gaining by being clubby with a bunch of guys who do really not much for the world except have a lovely time over there and take jets and whatnot? I mean, how does that correspond with the ideals of working for your people, not having a great party where you say you're going to do all kinds of things and don't do anything? So I just wonder what benefit would it give to him to be seen among this group?
Right. Well, maybe the use of the Davos as an example of what I had in mind isn't. But I mean, he's gone, and he's interacted, and I think had his own agenda in trying to promote at the time, China's view of the world. So I think, what does he benefit? Maybe two, and let's just put Davos aside. What I'm really talking about is his ability in multilateral settings with other leaders of the world to be an effective communicator of China's interests and use those interactions to bring about common ground, stabilize geopolitical tensions, and the like. I think he's more effective at the former. That is to say, I think he sees these sorts of high-level summitry as a great platform from which he can communicate China's principal interests and vision about how the world should work. And I think he's pretty effective at that. I mean, at least the message is very clear. Whether the message is getting taken on board and absorbed and accepted, that's another question. But he clearly sees those as those sorts of opportunities. But on that latter aspect of these meetings, and again, setting aside, what type of meeting it might be or what it represents for some, it's that ability to engage with leaders and do that hurly-burly and give and take and understandings to reach common ground, to emerge from those interactions with a kind of joint understanding about how the world can work and how we're going to cooperate and reduce tension and increase prosperity. He's not effective at that. And a part of it, reason for that is some of these personality and persona issues, in addition to just the direction of geopolitics these days, make it very difficult for him to do so. So that's what I meant by that. That's not likely to change. I think his circle of friends, the types of people that he can have those interactions with, seems to be dwindling. And maybe he may lose a major one if things continue to go badly in Russia.
Well, Bates, thank you so much. It's been very interesting, and I urge you all to have a look at his book, which is, I think at this particular moment in history, the questions we've been talking about are not epiphenomenal to the fate of the world, never mind our own country. So, thanks.
Thank you.